Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and welcome to a slightly different video than normal. I'm just rearranging my browser tabs. Cool. And what I want to talk about today is how third parties, and for right now, I'm going to go specifically with the libertarians because I'm not even going to bother with the Greens right now because they're just too small to make any headway, except in maybe one or two local elections in extremely urban or extremely liberal areas. And I don't like the term liberal and conservative because they kind of are meaningless in some regards. But you'll see I have, of course, the House, Senate, and presidential election maps up. And really, third parties shouldn't even be focusing on. They can get away with House and Senate races and gubernatorial elections, but they really need to be focusing on local elections, city councils, school boards, county boards, mayoral elections, certain judicial elections, Supreme Court races in certain states, stuff like that. And they need to be focusing on areas where there is a strong libertarian streak amongst the population, or where the people are, where there's a lot of independent voters. So seats like those in the Southwest. I'm actually going to zoom in here. And I'm just going to highlight every single one of them because it's actually important. And this is one of the reasons why the Republican Party has kind of been losing some ground in most of these states is because the Republican Party has been moving pretty conservative, and the most of the Republicans out in this area tend to be a little bit more socially liberal or culturally liberal. But in this area, the Republicans really like their guns, but they're also okay with, say, legalized marijuana and gay marriage and stuff like that. And this has caused a lot of these Republicans from this region to be called rhinos, especially in Arizona. But the reality is this is kind of more the old school Republican Party. But at the same time, these Republicans are also, traditionally fiscally, quote, conservative, which, again, is not exactly the best way to describe it, but okay, whatever. It's a terminology that will make the most sense to people. In addition, there's also the argument to be made that even then, a lot of the Republicans in this area aren't all that fiscally conservative, considering their penchant for bailouts and all that stuff. Considering, if I remember correctly, both McCain and a few of the other Republicans from this area voted for the bailouts in 2008 and 9. But there's a reason why a lot of libertarians tend to do pretty well in this area, historically speaking. Gary Johnson, of course, got 9% in 2016 in the presidential election in New Mexico. And he got 15% in the Senate election. Actually took second place in a few of the urban counties around Albuquerque, Santa Fe, places like that, which is extremely good for a libertarian, but not their best result. But it does indicate that libertarians can do very well in the Southwest. Of course, New Mexico is its own animal, and of course, Gary Johnson is from New Mexico, and he was a popular former Republican governor from New Mexico. So a little bit of residual effect there, but still, the fact that he was able to do so well is pretty good. There's a few other factors that cause him to be, cause libertarians to do better in this area than they otherwise would in, say, the Deep South. And that's because there are more swing voters, and the libertarians can actually appeal to demographics other than the traditional, quote, conservative base of evangelical Christians, and especially white people. But they'd have a decent chance of taking a decent amount of the college-educated white vote, because a lot of college-educated conservatives, again, I'm using that term pretty loosely here, tend to have a very libertarian streak in them. But I'm also extending that into the Mountain West because, again, they have that capacity to do well out there. And even just the West in general. Now, I'm not actually, I will go through and highlight California as well, because I could see the Libertarians doing better than the Republican Party as a whole in California, especially given that it's going to be harder to attack Libertarians on certain issues that Republicans can be considered easy prey on, whether or not it's justifiable or not. Right? And of course, Oregon would be a very good place as well. Washington, again, pretty ripe territory. And Alaska as well, okay? Alaska has the best performance for a libertarian ever in terms of the raw popular vote in any statewide election, and that was for a gubernatorial or Senate election, one of the two. If I remember correctly, it was a gubernatorial bid, which is very good, obviously. And it was in the 20s, but they didn't win, obviously, but they came close enough to winning that, they should have been able to keep that momentum going in the future, and they sort of have, because libertarians tend to do very well in Alaska for whatever reason. And this is why I'm sort of hesitant about certain political games like Political Machine and Political Process, because they don't really do third parties for a lot of reasons. But it is disappointing that they don't do third parties and independent candidates. Now, moving on to the other area where I can see libertarians doing potentially well is New England. Because New England tends to be pretty good for third party candidates, but they also tend to be these are areas that tend to have a lot of independent voters as well as a lot of swing voters who don't really align with one party or the other and can vote one way or another. But they tend to track towards the Democrats at the federal level because they want more liberal social policies. Again, loose usage of that word. But if you look at the state level, Vermont, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and up until, 2018, Maine, all four of those states had Republican governors. And Connecticut in 2018 was considered a very competitive election. To a lesser extent, so is Rhode Island. And it's not unusual to see Republican governors being extremely popular up here. So there is some appeal for fiscal conservatism in this area, but they want, civil liberties protected, except for Massachusetts and on the whole guns thing. Rhode Island and Connecticut aren't too bad on the guns issue. Vermont is not as good as it once was, but Maine and New Hampshire are still pretty okay on that front. But the point is that unlike a lot of super liberal areas, they're not as hostile to gun ownership. Excluding Massachusetts, and to lesser extents, excluding Connecticut and Rhode Island. But Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, that are all surprisingly decent. or in some cases pretty good. And Vermont used to be actually the best state in the Union when it came to gun rights, but how times change. But the point is that these areas tend to line up with the Libertarian Party on a lot of things, and the Republicans up there tend to have somewhat libertarian streaks. I mean, not fully, but they're not, super conservative Republicans. I mean, look at Charlie Baker and Phil Scott. Chris Sununu to a lesser extent. Paul LePage was just weird. But, you look at it, and that's one area that I think is prime for libertarians to start trying to assemble a base of support. And then another base of support is actually really interesting, and that would be Appalachia, Nova, that'd be Appalachia in Northern Virginia. And I'm including certain parts of Georgia. I'm not going to include Alabama, even though it does have some Appalachian parts down into this area. But really Appalachia, because the reason for this is this area tends to be a little insular. The terrain is somewhat rough, excluding the Nova parts. But it produces some tight-knit communities, but it also produces a streak of independence. And a lot of these people are inclined towards, to an extent, social conservatism, but and weirdly enough, these people tend to be somewhat pro-union, pro-working class. They're okay with government spending on things like infrastructure and all that, which seems counter to what libertarians want. But the people out here are okay with libertarians for weird reasons. It's probably because the libertarians are very focused on privacy, allowing each local community to do as they see fit within their region, and or get the federal government as out of things as possible and let local governments do what they do. And that will appeal to a state like West Virginia, that'll appeal to eastern, Appalachian Kentucky, Appalachian Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and certain parts of coal country is, you know best how to run your life, so you go ahead and go do it. And that's what people in Appalachia like. And that would be where I would start trying to form a bench for the Libertarian Party. And a similar case can be made for the Senate, that Libertarians should be targeting those western states, New England states, West Virginia, and maybe you can make an argument for Virginia and Kentucky. Kentucky especially because they have Rand Paul, who actually endorsed Gary Johnson in the Senate race in 2018 over the Republican candidate. And you can make an argument for Tennessee, North Carolina even. But I would really just be focused on, I'll leave Virginia up there because interesting things happen. But those would be the first states I think the Libertarians should target when it comes to Senate. Now, obviously, they need to be working as local as possible, trying to win as many local elections as they can get. And, of course, they need to be focusing on doing the best in the West when it comes to the presidency. And, again, you can make an argument for these areas being where they should be spending their resources on in the short run when it comes to the presidency. But the real focus of the Libertarian Party needs to be, at least for a short amount of time, and again, this works for the Greens as well, that they need to be focused on local elections, city councils, mayoral seats, county boards of supervisors, school boards, and looking less at trying to get federal funding for presidential elections or trying to win presidential elections. You're going to come off as a more serious party if you're able to not only gain seats on city councils and mayoral seats and et cetera, you're going to actually be able to implement your policies at that level and say, this is how we intend to do things. And in my opinion, when libertarians implement their plans successfully, and it works, because it will, again, grain of salt, that's my opinion, you're going to be able to say, okay, well, I'm going to run for the House district. And if you look at what we did in our town, and you look at how we did it, and we implemented it, we're going to take that to Congress or, state legislatures or, gubernatorial seats and stuff like that. I'm going to implement the policies that I did in a similar way, providing the state house or, whatever groups you're going to have to work with us, whatever allows us to get some of it implemented. And this is going to benefit people. And then you're going to be able to build from there. You're going to be able to say, okay, I'm going to pick these people to be my advisors, and after a little bit, they've got enough experience, they can run in local elections, and you're going to start recycling your bench. When you start at the presidency, it's going to be much harder to build a local organization because you're going to have so much turnover if you decide to use your cabinet officials and your staff and your advisors to fill out the bench at lower levels, because now you're going to have to either bring them right back in after they win their elections, or you're going to have to find completely new advisors every cycle. So it's easier to build a bench and then choose the best candidates out of that bench for the higher levels than it is to win an election at a higher level and then try and fill out a bench so you have successors. But obviously this is speculation a little bit. This is kind of talking strategy and how to do things. Basically, third parties need to be working on a bottom-up campaign rather than a top-down campaign. Obviously, they shouldn't abandon presidential runs, and they should be focusing on trying to get on the ballot in all 50 states. But what they really need to be doing is building up that bench while they do it. So basically, find someone and draft a presidential candidate who can self-fund while using the party's funds to run in local elections, House races, Senate seats. If you can find a few Senate candidates, that'd be great, and that will also boost party turnout. And but you also need to find candidates who are somewhat moderate. Your Gary Johnsons of the world. As much as I think he's a bit too statist for me, to use a libertarian term, he is at least palatable to the vast majority of American libertarians, because at the end of the day, he's better than the Republicans and Democrats, at least in a libertarian's mind. While we'd like some level of ideological purity, we'll take what we can get. And unfortunately, what we can get right now has been cast offs of the major parties. I mean, you look at Lincoln Chafee, who was running as a libertarian this cycle, but his baggage was that he was, very much in support of gun control. He was very much not what you would consider as a libertarian. Even though he tried to say, "Oh no, I really am a libertarian," not really. No. Um, and that's why he didn't gain any traction. Of course, in 2008, it was Bob Barr, who was a former Republican. And you look at it, you look at the party, you have basically former Republican, former Republican, former Republican, former Republican, catching on, getting, noticing a trend. But that's to be expected, honestly. But anyway, I hope y'all enjoyed this little look at how a third party can actually gain prominence, and hope you enjoyed. As always, likes, comments, subscriptions really do help. On Friday, I'm going to be doing an in-depth look at Colorado and how to actually look at the race there. See y'all next time. Take it easy. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.